Friends, we are picking up in John chapter 7 today as we gather, but before we do that, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever felt like you are just completely exhausted? I mean, of course you have, right? That you've been going 100 miles per hour, you're stretched in all different ways. I have 3 small children, and I feel like that pretty much sums up my whole life. I'm just exhausted right now. But there's this next level of exhaustion that comes when we are just spiritually tired. That we literally can't muster up anything else. There's nothing left in us to pour out. If you've ever been there before, that's where we are digging into John chapter 7 today. People were gathered together for this thing called the Feast of Tabernacles, and they were celebrating on this final day the faithfulness of God. Have you ever been there when you've been spiritually just tired and exhausted, and you go back and you think about the ways that God has proven himself to you over and over again? That's a practice I have in my life when I get to that place of like, what am I doing? That I can go back and say, you know what? I know the character of God. These are the ways that he's been faithful to me in the past, and I pull on those things to push me through some of those hard moments. That's what these people were really doing. They're coming to celebrate what God had done in the lives of those people who have come before them, specifically looking at the Israelites as they're wandering throughout the desert. Could you imagine the physical exhaustion? They've been wandering for years and years after God, and really that physical exhaustion has taken over, but I can only imagine that there's a spiritual exhaustion that goes with that. They are ready. God, you've promised us this. When are you going to take us to that promised land? When are you going to bring us all the way through? Have you been there before? God, you said you were going to do this, and I'm ready. I'm ready to be there. And so as they're physically starting to get exhausted, they're running out of resources, Moses takes his staff and he strikes it against a rock, and water comes exploding out. God had just shown himself to them and met this physical need and refreshed them. But I would imagine that that physical manifestation of God being there also refreshed their spirit, also refreshed their soul, that God was there, that he was faithful, he was going to deliver them. So these people during the Feast of Tabernacles have gathered together to celebrate that rock to water miracle of Moses. So as they're gathered in the streets, they're taking these pictures and they're pouring them out, remembering what God has done in their lives. Now, when you've been to that point of exhaustion, I think of it as dehydration, right? When we are physically dehydrated, our bodies begin to tell us. I've been there before, living in the desert, where my body has gotten physically dehydrated, and it tells me I get thirsty, I get aches and pains, right? We start to get headaches. Things start to happen in our body as warning signs that we are getting dehydrated. I think the same thing starts to happen with our souls. That when we start to get spiritually dehydrated, our spirit starts to tell us. I start just cutting off on my kids and my husband, and I start to get worry and get fearful and have anxiety over things that I shouldn't even be worried about. That all of these new characteristics start to come into my life as warning signs of, Vanessa, you are getting spiritually dehydrated. So as these people are gathered together and they're celebrating this rock to water miracle that God has performed for the people before them, an amazing thing happens. Jesus is actually right here in the crowd. So we're going to pick up in John 7:37. It says, on the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures has said, streams of living water will flow from within him. By this he meant that the Spirit whom was believed in him were later to receive. Up to that point, the Spirit had not yet been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. So this is what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I know that you're here celebrating how faithful God was in the lives of those who have come before you, and that's great. But here's the reality. I'm standing right in front of you. I'm right here. You don't have to live off of the overflow of what I've done in the lives of people so long ago. You can just come to me in my presence, and I will produce something new in you, something that will refresh your soul. I think that I'm really guilty of living off of the overflow of what God's doing in other people's lives often. Like I go to church on Sunday and I expect that the overflow of what God's doing in my pastor's life is going to jump over to me and refresh me. And sometimes that is true, but I can't live off of that. Or in a Bible study, I start to expect that Beth Moore or Priscilla Shirer or some of these great theologians who are creating these Bible studies, that what God is doing in their lives, that's going to refresh my soul. And I think it does. It gives us a taste, but it doesn't actually quench the thirst of our soul. And Jesus knew that. He said, if you're thirsty, you don't have to live off of the overflow. You need to come to me and take a drink. Sometimes I think that we just forget that we're in the same room as Jesus, that we can actually approach him at any time and we can allow him to revive our weary souls. We don't have to be in the presence of some great theologian. We can be in the presence of Jesus. And so this is really my invitation to you, to come to Jesus, to come and take a drink, that you don't have to wait for something else to happen to revive your soul, but you can go right to the source himself. And that's what Jesus was saying. So maybe it's at night before you go to bed that you just give an invitation to Jesus. You know my needs. Meet me where I am. Maybe it's when you're getting into the car and you know that that's when your thoughts just tend to go wild. Jesus, I need you to meet me right here, right where I am. Right? Wherever that spot is for you, wherever you start to feel weary, that you invite the presence of Jesus, because he says, I am right here. Come to me and take a drink.